Hello there everyone, Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and in this lesson we're going to take a look at creating a desert landscape using pastels and pastel pencils on PastelMat paper. Now in this particular image we're going to exploit a color triad of secondary colors, and we're also going to try to create some visual rhythm through our mark making. Now, if you're new to the channel or you just simply haven't done so yet, why not subscribe to the channel and click on that bell so that you get notified each time we post a new video. We cover a broad variety of drawing and painting subjects and media here. And if you like this video, make sure you click on the like button as well. That'll help others find this video. Now, as I mentioned before, we're going to create a desert landscape in this particular lesson. We're going to be working with Rembrandt pastels, and we're also going to be using Carbothello pastel pencils to add a few details here and there. And as I mentioned before, we're going to be working on PastelMat paper by Clairefontaine. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the process. We'll begin here on light gray PastelMat paper using a dark brown pastel pencil. And we're just going to loosely and lightly sketch out areas where we see contrast. Of course, this includes the horizon line and the distant mountains, or at least the contours of the distant mountains, but also some of the areas in the middle ground and foreground where we see darks nestled next to lights. Our initial sketch here is very loose. We're not concerned about any details in this initial sketch. We just want to get a layout of the composition in place on the paper so that when we start making applications with the pastel sticks, it's no longer any guesswork. And then, of course, we're going to start with the background and work our way to the middle ground and lastly, the foreground. This means that we're going to start with the distant sky. As you can see here, I'm starting with a light blue pastel stick. Now, we'll add a variety of different blues to the background, but for right now, we just want to establish the spaces in between each one of the clouds. So as you can see, I'm leaving open spaces for the shapes of the clouds. After we've made our first pass with the light blue pastel, I'm going to switch over to a slightly lighter blue pastel. This one leans a little bit more towards green. In this particular case, we want the values of the blues that we apply to be a little bit lighter, closer to the horizon line, and slightly darker, closer to the top of the sky. Now, after this initial application of the lighter blue-green is applied, we go back with our original light blue pastel here and ease the transition from those more blue-green applications. And at this point, I decide that the transition between the lighter blue-green to the slightly darker blue above is still a little bit too harsh. So I go with a slightly lighter blue here and then a slightly darker blue at the top of the picture plane. Of course, these initial applications are relatively rough, but as you'll see, we can smooth out the transitions between the darker blue and the lighter blue at the bottom with additional applications. Now, of course, there is a little bit of smudging involved here and there with the finger, but as you can see, we can also create those smoother transitions without any blending with our finger or a blending tool. We can just simply apply additional applications of similar values of color over the top to ease those transitions. Now here again, a slightly lighter blue is applied over the top of the light blue-green. That mutes the light blue-green to a certain degree. It's still there, we can still see it, but it makes it feel a little bit more natural. And then it's time to move on to the shapes of the clouds. As you can see here, I'm using a very light blue to make the initial shapes of the clouds. This may appear as a white, but it's actually a very, very light blue. Now, clouds, of course, are interesting objects to draw and paint. Some clouds have harder edges, and some have softer edges, and some clouds have both softer and harder edges. We can see this with our particular subject as well. So I'm just paying attention to the photo reference and softening up the edges where appropriate with a quick smudge of the finger. Now, as you can see here, I'm experimenting with a gray here to try to establish some of the shadowed areas on the clouds. Remember, clouds are also three-dimensional objects. This means they have highlights and shadows and middle values just like anything else. I start here with a medium value gray-green, and then I quickly switch over to a more neutral gray here to finish off the initial applications of the shadowed areas of the clouds. This warmer gray acts as a nice initial application. Of course, we'll have to go back in a moment and make some of these shadows areas a little bit darker in value to make them a little bit more believable. There just simply isn't enough contrast with this first application. Now, of course, there are some areas within our sky where we don't really have defined white fluffy clouds, but we have basically just a misty look in areas where we have a suggestion of a cloud. So for these areas, I'll use a bit of that light gray to address those particular misty clouds. And then, of course, we'll switch over to a slightly darker gray here and make some of the shadows a little bit stronger. Now, here again, this is a warmer gray here. Now, it'll depend on the type of clouds you're trying to depict in your image and the light within the scene, and also the mood you're trying to convey in your image on whether or not you choose a gray that's a little bit cooler or a gray that's a little bit warmer, or maybe a color that's not even a gray at all for the shadowed areas in your clouds. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that working with pastels does require some layering. In fact, in most cases, the more that you layer, the more complexity you're going to build up in the color, and the more complexity usually leads to a more believable image. Now, in this particular image, we are trying to create an image that is easily understood by the viewer, but we're not going to the lengths of trying to make this super photorealistic, of course. So this gives us a little bit more freedom with our mark making, and we can approach applying the pastels as more of a painting medium, and think of these strokes more like brush strokes. And you'll see throughout the process, as we get closer to the foreground and middle ground, we start to concentrate more on the brush strokes. Now on the surface, these clouds, of course, appear mostly neutral, meaning blacks, grays, and whites are the primary colors that we would use to create them, of course. But even within neutral subjects, we often see hints of color. And in this particular image, we're attempting to pull out a little bit more of that color triad of purple, orange, and green. These, of course, are the secondary colors. So in the sky, I'm going to give a few hints of purple here and there. Now we'll return back with our original very, very light blue. Remember, this is translating almost as a white, but it actually is a very light blue here. And we're going to pull out a little bit more of the highlights that we see on the clouds now that we've got some of the middle tones or the midtones and the shadows in place. You can really start to see the contrast here as we start to do so. And as I'm going back through with this second pass, I'm also concentrating on some of the edges that exist on the top side of the clouds. For the most part in this scene, most of the harder edges exist on the upper portions of each one of the clouds. You can see that we can take marks and basically eat into some of the shadowed areas. And this really starts to develop some of the illusion of the form of the clouds. Now, although soft pastels do give you immediate feedback when you make marks, meaning you get an idea of how things are going to translate as soon as you make a mark on the surface, they still do require quite a bit of patience. And I see a lot of beginning artists with pastels or artists who are just starting out with pastels become impatient. They may put one layer or two layers or even three layers of applications on the surface, and they're not really sure why their images aren't translating as they would like them to translate. And that's because pastels, like other art making material, does require you to be a little bit patient in the process. So allow your painting to slowly develop as you continue to apply colors. Don't try to rush things, and like I said, things will slowly develop. As you can see here, we're going back with our initial light blue here and using it to do some negative painting around the edges of the clouds. Again, further defining some of those stronger edges, some of those hard edges that happen around the shapes of the clouds. Now, there should be a little bit of warmth here in the clouds, so I'm going back with a very, very light yellow here. I know it may be hard to believe that this is actually a light yellow, but it is. And as we're applying it, you can see the contrast between the cooler light blue that we applied previously. Of course, the light within the scene is warmer, so these warmer highlights help to convey this to the viewer. But even after these warmer applications, we still have a few areas that need just a little bit more punch, so we'll sparingly use a bit of white to bring out some additional highlights. And even though all three of these colors that we used for our highlights are similar to one another, they're still slightly different. And of course, this leads to greater depth within the scene and also a greater illusion of realism. Now, of course, we have some distant mountains, so as we continue to work our way down the picture plane, we'll go ahead and start addressing the shapes for those distant mountains with a bit of purple. If you'll remember, we're trying to pull out more of a secondary color scheme. This is a color triad. The colors are equidistant from each other on the color wheel. These colors again are purple, orange, and green, and of course these are the secondary colors. While it's never required to use a specific color scheme in your drawings or paintings, it's usually a good idea. This means that maybe you make up or invent the color scheme completely from your reference or subject, meaning that you just alter the colors, of course, trying to match the values, but alter the colors so that they make sense with your specific color scheme. Or it may mean that you try to exploit colors that you see within the scene, which is what we're doing here. If we look closely and try to find a color scheme in this particular reference, we can really see that the orange, purples, and greens are dominant, so it makes sense to pull those out in our particular image here. Now, of course, incorporating a color scheme is going to add a bit more punch to our image by increasing the contrast in this case, but it also adds a sense of harmony and unity to the piece since we're limiting our color palette to a degree. You can see in this distant mountain on the left side of the picture plane, I've just darkened it a bit by adding a bit of dark brown over the top of our purple application, and then another application of purple over the top. Now you'll also notice that I'm starting to layer the mountains as we start working to the middle ground. Of course, as I mentioned before, we're starting with the background, then working to the middle ground, and then lastly the foreground. In this particular case, this essentially means we're starting at the top of the picture plane and working downward. This is because pastels can be approached like an opaque painting medium like oils or acrylics, meaning that we can layer over the top of applications that we already have in place and cover them completely. This means it wouldn't make sense to do the mountains first and then go back and work around the mountains to create the sky, because we would have to work around the mountains. It makes more sense to address the sky and address it completely first, then move on to the middle ground where we can make applications that overlap the sky. Of course, this keeps our drawing nice and neat and much cleaner. And it also eliminates any glow that might happen around the edges of objects. Now, as we continue to work on the clouds, our application technique is still the same. We're still focused on building up layers of applications of the pastel on the surface. You can see I'm working very loosely, and here again, I'm thinking about the marks that I'm making with the pastels in a similar way as I would think about brushstrokes in a painting. I'm quickly laying down a variety of different colors that are all similar. You can see all of these are red oranges or more earthy reds or lighter earthier yellows. And as we layer these colors on the surface, slowly we'll get a better idea of where our shadows are located and our highlights, of course. And then we'll progressively push the contrast by adding lighter versions of these colors, as you can see here with a lighter earthier yellow. And then we'll add darker versions of our colors, of course incorporating a bit of brown as well. So we're not going to force the texture or force the details out of the image. We're going to allow them to slowly develop. Now, as we continue to make applications, we'll get a little bit more precise and our details will start to gradually emerge from the surface. Here again, it's important to stay patient. Now, you can see I'm using a little bit of warm gray on the distant mountain over on the left side towards the left center portion of the picture plane. But over on the right side of the picture plane, we're using mostly those earthier reds and oranges. And of course, this is simply because I'm using information that I'm getting from the photo reference. I'm not following the photo reference exactly, but I'm using it as what it should be used as, a reference. So if I need to have an idea of where a darker shadow or the shape of a particular shadow might be, I'll refer to the reference. But I'm also allowing myself to have a bit of freedom in my mark making and a bit of freedom in my choice of color as well. So now you can see we're starting to push the value range by adding some of the darker values here. And of course, these darker values are going to represent shadows. And as we start to build up the contrast in value, of course, then we start to better understand the texture of the objects that we're including in the scene. One of the wonderful aspects of pastels is the variety of different marks that you can create, of course. Now, of course, the marks that we're creating here really can't be replicated with a medium like colored pencils, for example, and they really can't be exactly replicated with an opaque painting medium like oils or acrylics. Of course, our thought process might be similar to that of oils or acrylics when we're applying pastels, but the marks aren't quite the same. Pastels, or working with pastels, allow you to create rhythm very easily in your work. And this rhythm, of course, can be accomplished by repetitive stroke making. Of course, repetition is the key to creating rhythm, whether that's repetition in a song when we're talking about audio rhythm, or repetition in a piece of art when we're talking about visual rhythm. So we can really do a lot with our mark making with pastels, of course, to create that sense of rhythm in a piece. And in this particular piece, I'm going to try to exploit that aspect here and really give this piece a sense of rhythm. Now, we're starting to see that develop a little bit here in the main mountain on the right side of the picture plane, and we'll see this develop a little bit more as we work to the middle ground and the foreground. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that rhythm when we get to that location. But for now, let's talk about the pastel pencil applications that I'm making here. At this point in the drawing, I started to notice that it was getting a little bit difficult to create some of the details that I wanted to create with just the bulky stick pastels. So at this point, I switched over to using a few pastel pencils to develop some of those details. There are a few areas on these distant mountains where there needed to be a little bit more precision, of course, so I used similar colors here with the pastel pencils as I did with the stick pastels to begin to refine some of the details here. Here again, I didn't want to get too carried away. I didn't want to push this image to a level where it was photorealistic. I still wanted it to have a feel of being a painting, and that's why I didn't go too crazy here with the pastel pencil applications. Now, one thing that we haven't discussed at this point, but is something that is important to point out here, is if you've ever worked with pastels before, you know that they are somewhat of a messy medium and they produce quite a bit of dust. But one thing you might have noticed with this particular demonstration is there's not a lot of dust that's produced by the pastels. And this is for a combination of reasons. One, the brand of pastel I'm using here are Rembrandt pastels, and their dust is considerably less than what you might find in some products that might be a little bit less expensive. So typically speaking, the less expensive the pastel material is, or the pastel brand you're working with, you're likely to see more dust. Now, the main reason, though, that we're seeing less dust here is because of the surface. PastelMat paper is a wonderful surface to work on. It does create unique marks on the surface when pastels are applied, and of course you can use this surface for colored pencil applications as well, but it does hold the pastel material in place when you make marks, so there is considerably less dust. Now, of course, this paper is a little bit pricey, but if you're trying to cut down on the amount of dust that you produce when you're working with pastels, and that has been a hindrance to you, then of course it might be a surface that you look into. Now, as I've been talking about pastel dust and the surface that we're working on, you can see that we're just continuing to work our way down from the mountains. Again, just progressively working our way closer to the foreground. I've added a few trees here and there by first applying a bit of a light yellow-green, and then a slightly darker yellow-green, and then a bit of black in areas to make the shadows a little bit stronger. Now, you have to be careful when you use black, of course, with any colored medium, because black can make an image look flat, but when it's mixed with another color, it still looks fairly natural. And with these pastels, of course, applying black over the top of an area where you've already applied a color, a little bit of mixing occurs. And if you find that the black is too strong, then you can always go back over the top of it with a different color to make it appear more natural. I'm also using a lighter touch when I'm applying this bit of black here too, to make sure that it is just making the values a little bit darker and not translating as a super flat black area. Now we're starting to incorporate some minty greens, and as you'll see, we're going to use a variety of different greens, mostly warm greens for this scene, and we're also going to start adding a few details and darker areas and so on as we work our way towards the middle ground. Again, this is just like painting with an opaque medium, an opaque painting medium. We're going to basically establish some of the darker values and lighter values, and then go in and continue to develop some of the midtones and push that range of value, push that contrast where necessary. But what's great about pastels, of course, is we can just lay down color really quickly, and if it doesn't seem to work, we can go right over the top of it. This particular surface has adequate tooth that allows you to make lots of layers. Of course, every surface that you work on is going to have its limit, but the more tooth or more texture a particular paper has, generally speaking, the more layers you can apply to the surface. And while this paper might not look like it has a heavy tooth here on the video, it does actually have a fairly strong tooth, so you can make multiple layered applications there without running through all the tooth. You'll notice that you get to a point when you're working on a smoother surface where you can't apply any more pastel. It almost just falls right off the surface, and that's because for the most part you filled up the tooth or texture of the paper. Now, basically how we're approaching these small bushes, which might seem intimidating, is we're starting with larger shapes of color, and then we're progressively working to smaller shapes of color. And that's usually a good approach when you're using any opaque painting medium. So you can see I keep referring to opaque painting mediums, of course, and that's because working with pastels is similar to working with an opaque painting medium. So if you're having trouble seeing these shapes of color or value, it might be a good idea to actually squint at the reference that you're working from or the subject that you're working from, and that will help you better understand those shapes of color and value. Put those down first on the surface, do so loosely, and then progressively start to work to smaller shapes. Now, as you can see here, some of the colors on the left side of the picture plane are slightly different. We see a little bit more of those violets and purples. We also see a few more neutral colors, of course, but we want to make sure that our entire scene feels harmonious and unified. So even though we might not see some of the colors that we incorporated on the right side of the picture plane in our reference, we're going to go ahead and include them on the left side of the picture plane as well, and throughout the piece in general, to make sure that there is a sense of harmony and unity in the final result. Here you can see me laying down those larger shapes initially, and I'm not overthinking the colors that I'm grabbing here. I'm grabbing colors that I feel like are a close match to what I'm seeing in the reference, or they might be slightly different from what I see in the reference, but they work for the image that I'm trying to create on my drawing surface. So don't overthink it. Try to work fairly quickly when you start to lay down some of these larger shapes, and then as you work to the smaller shapes, you can become a little bit more refined and a little bit more thoughtful with your applications. As we're working here to the foreground, I'm establishing the shadowed areas mostly with dark browns and dark earthy reds, and I'm also establishing the floor of the desert here with a variety of different natural looking yellows. These are very similar to yellow ochre, and also some hints of that lighter yellow green in areas as well. Of course, those lighter yellow greens are going to tie in with the yellow greens throughout the piece, of course. And at this point, we're really starting to see those oranges and greens be dominant, but we haven't quite yet pulled out the purples, which we'll do that in just a moment. We just have those distant purple mountains, of course, at this point. Now you can see as we continue to layer the variety of different yellows in the foreground, we start to create a little bit more depth and a sense of texture, and this, of course, has been the theme throughout. You just start with those larger shapes and progressively work to smaller shapes, of course. And then you can layer over the top details to your heart's content. As you can see see here, we're adding a few dried blades of grass. I guess these are blades of grass, some dried plant life, and also some branches and things here and there with a very light gray. Now, if you'll recall, earlier I spoke about creating rhythm with the pastels, and we're starting to see this rhythm develop as we make these repetitive strokes, especially here in the foreground. You can see that these repetitive strokes continue all the way from the bottom left portion of the picture plane up to the middle right portion of the picture plane and almost carry us back to the distant mountains, of course. And this is creating a sense of eye flow or eye movement, or basically some visual interaction by our viewer, which basically pulls the viewer into the piece and moves them around the composition. Now we'll continue to layer applications, and you can see here that I've applied a bit of darker values to some of those dried branches and things in the foreground, and then I'm continuing to add a few more hints of some darker oranges here in the foreground as well. Now we're ready to pull in a little bit more of that purple. So we're going to concentrate on pulling in some of these purple areas, mainly on the plants that are here in the foreground and the middle ground. And so we're going to continue here using those repetitive strokes here with the pastel with a few different versions of lighter purple. Now, of course, these purples aren't clearly evident in our photo reference, but that's okay. Remember, we're trying to incorporate a color scheme here using a color triad of secondary colors. And once this purple is added, or at least once we've applied it to several different locations within the piece, it helps harmonize the piece and also increase the contrast. What happens is not only do the purples stand out, but also the oranges and the greens as well, because we have that strong color contrast between those colors. Now, I've also strengthened some of the oranges that we see in the foreground as well, just to heighten that contrast even further. I've also added a few strokes that make the dried plant life feel a little bit more natural by having some of those strokes go a little bit more horizontal or more diagonal instead of uniformly shooting straight up into the air. And I'm also adding a few more hints of color here and there for some of the highlights on our branches in the foreground, again just adding a little bit more depth and more interest to these locations. And lastly, we'll return to where we began and clean up the sky one final time, basically just working on that transition from the slightly darker blue at the top to the lighter blue at the bottom. And now our desert scene completed with pastels is now complete. Of course, this image exploits a secondary color scheme. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you were able to pick up a couple of things here and there. Remember, if you're new to the channel or you haven't done so yet, make sure that you subscribe and click on that bell notification so that you get notified when we post new videos. If you want to check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free, you can do so. I'll leave a link in the description below. And if you want to check out our fantastic membership program, which includes a variety of drawing and painting courses on a variety of subjects and media, weekly live lessons, weekly critiques that are part of the Members Minute, and a year-long curriculum for visual arts teachers, you can do so. Of course, I'll leave a link in the description below. Everyone starts out with a week-long trial so you can try out the program and see if it's right for you. Again, thanks for watching, and as always, I wish you all the very best in your artistic success.